Greetings and welcome. Today we'll be discussing the historian Marc Bloch, who comes into the course for two different reasons, which I'll talk about today. But to begin, just a little bit of framing, why would we discuss Marc Bloch? He was an historian, a very important historian of the 20th century, but he was also a French patriot. He was involved in both World War I as an enlisted man and then officer, and he was involved also in World War II as an officer in the French army, and then served and led an outfit in the French resistance in Lyon. And my reason for introducing Marc Bloch into this course, really there are two reasons. One is that his own personal story raises many really important and deep questions. How individuals respond to evil, how one individual man can respond to evil in his society and outside his society, what is personal integrity, and how to think about the blight of anti-Semitism in Europe in the 20th century. But really that leads us to think about bigotry in many societies and at many times. So his personal life allows us to kind of open up the question of bigotry and ethnic and racial and religious hatred. But on the side of Marc Bloch's contributions as an historian, I believe that his thinking about historical understanding is hugely valuable in this course because he provides a way of thinking about the past. In this course, we're really interested in thinking about both normative issues, what you might call philosophical issues, but also historical issues, how to interpret big features of human history. And Marc Bloch is a wonderful entry point into serious, hard thinking about the basis of historical research. He allows us to think about the big questions of truth. What is truth in an historical interpretation? The idea of interpretation itself. How do we interpret the Holocaust, for example, which is a question that we will discuss? How should evidence be used in an historical account of a period or a time or an event? The fact that all historical accounts must be selective. It isn't possible to offer an account of everything that happened, even in a relatively short period of time. And so selectivity is an important historical issue. And there are other important issues faced by the historian as he or she does work in trying to understand various features of the past. Marc Bloch's book, which you will be reading cover to cover, The Historian's Craft, was written during his personal struggles as a soldier and citizen, and it is also a book which represents what I regard as really important thinking about the historian's task and the methods which he can bring to bear on the challenge of understanding and interpreting the past. So let's talk a little bit about Marc Bloch's history. You've read three kind of biographical interpretations of Marc Bloch. With Bloch's life experience, World War I was for French society and for the French army a relatively clear conflict. It was not a hugely divisive war for France, in spite of the fact that trench warfare was simply horrific for all sides. And if you have read any novels or historical treatments of World War I, you will know that it was a simply terrible place for massive death, disease, injury, frustration, hundreds of thousands of people killed in a day, sometimes by orders from the general staff, which were just kind of crazy and stupid ideas or plans for how to attack the enemy. So World War I was itself a huge, complex, and frustrating event, but at least from a kind of moral and political point of view, it was Bloch's view that it was not morally ambiguous in France. World War II, on the other hand, was a demoralizing event for France, demoralizing in a very deep way. The most basic fact is that France had perhaps the most powerful army in the world, at the time that it was attacked by Germany, and yet it was defeated within a matter of months. The German army was able to evade the very famous Maginot Line, which was created in France to prevent exactly what occurred, an invasion of France by Germany. Germany was able to go around the Maginot Line and invade France, and the French army collapsed very quickly. And Bloch, writing a book more or less at the time and shortly thereafter, a book called Strange Defeat, tried to understand why this occurred. And he paid attention to the military misfortunes. He paid attention to the fact that the general staff was confused. The general staff had prepared for fighting that would be similar to World War I, but the war that the Germans were fighting, Blitzkrieg War, rapid movement of armor, this was not the war that France had prepared for. And then there was just a kind of dramatic overconfidence on the part of French generals that they had a 10-to-1 advantage. So within the army, there were serious dysfunctions and failures. But we will discuss in just a minute the failures which occurred in elite circles within French leadership as well. And those social conditions in France, those social and political conditions, really had to do with the struggle between conservatives on the right and people on the left, what you might call Labour Party, Socialist Party. The Socialist Party of France had won the presidential election. A man named Léon Blum was elected president. And there was serious kind of internal disagreement in France about the policies which Blum had promised to bring into being. They were really kind of social welfare policies of the sort that are very familiar today. But in France, they created a lot of unhappiness in the conservative leadership of the country. And so, quoting from one of the essays that you read, these leaders on the right were only too ready to despair of the country they had been called upon to defend, and of the people who furnished the soldiers they commanded. They were ready to find consolation in the thought that beneath the ruins of France, a shameful regime might be crushed to death. And the regime they're talking about is their own presidency, their own president in the government of Léon Blum. The illustration here is, in one sense, familiar to you. It is the evacuation at Dunkirk with a little bit of a twist. We think of the Dunkirk evacuation as being an evacuation of English armies, British armies from France, but also a very large portion of the French army was evacuated. And Marc Bloch participated in the evacuation of French forces and the troops that he had responsibility for from on these, kind of tiny boats which were used in the Dunkirk evacuation. So it's a very interesting and dramatic period of history in the course of World War II, but also in terms of French history. So Bloch tried to make sense of the moral failure of the country in fighting the Germans when they were aggressively invaded and attacked by Germany. And it wasn't an intelligence failure. It wasn't as though no one had anticipated that the Germans might attack. They had, after all, attacked, invaded, and crushed and treated very brutally Poland, which had led to declaration of war by France and Great Britain. And yet France failed to marshal an effective defense of the country. They failed to support what one of your authors describes in these terms, the greatest virtues of France: democracy, liberty, and a desire to raise the level of justice and equality for every citizen. So this is Marc Bloch's thinking, that the greatest virtues of France are a commitment to democracy, a commitment to liberty, and a desire to raise the standards of justice and equality for all citizens. And it is his diagnosis that the right, the conservatives in France, really did not support those goals and supported a slogan which had some currency, better Hitler than Blum. So the conservative opposition to the president, Léon Blum, did not vigorously oppose the German attack. They did not help France come together as a unified military force. And the military leadership of the French army, according to Bloch's analysis in Strange Defeat, was unprepared for war, but also morally unprepared for war. They were not ready to fight an aggressive and heavily armed enemy. He believes the troops that he led and directed fought bravely, but they were not well led and their efforts were ineffectual. So after Bloch and his troops were evacuated to Dunkirk, Bloch spent less than a day in Britain and then returned to France. He returned to France, returned to Lyon, where he eventually, within a few weeks or month, made contact with the resistance in Lyon and volunteered to serve in the resistance in Lyon. And Lyon was one of the major centers of resistance activity in France. As you've read from these articles, his personal security was very uncertain. It's terrifying. If you were watching a movie, you might say, I don't want to see these scenes. It's too scary. This middle-aged, mild professor walking around in Lyon with the Gestapo everywhere. And indeed, he was betrayed by someone who knew his identity. He was arrested, tortured, and executed. And ironically, he was executed because the authorities, the Vichy authorities and Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, feared that their crimes would be discovered at the prison where Marc Bloch and other resistance prisoners were being held. They would be discovered by the Allied armies, which had successfully invaded France through Normandy and were advancing in the direction of Lyon. And so the prisoners were taken out and were shot. The death of Marc Bloch is described in very dramatic tones, but I think very truthful tones. On the right here, by the way, you see a small map of the portion of France where Lyon is. It's kind of good to have an idea of where these events took place. And in the lower part, this is the prison where Bloch and other resistance prisoners were held, and eventually they were taken from this prison and shot. But I'd like to read these two passages. A witness told of a stoic scene where Bloch and 24 others were led to a field and there faced the firing squad with no pleas, no cries, except Vive la France. He had devoted his life to France's best ideals of liberty and equality, even after many others had abandoned theirs. And the second quote I wanted to bring to your attention, writing to Fernand Braudel, who is another of the greatest historians of the 1930s and 40s in Europe, writing to Fernand Braudel in a German prisoner of war camp to announce the death, Lucien Febvre provided a characteristic epitome. Quote, "The loss of Marc Bloch is irreparable. All this end of his life has been magnificent. He had succeeded in acting out his aspirations not only as a scholar, but as a citizen and as a man, a success that is not given to many of us." That's the connection I was interested in having you see, the connection between his life as a scholar and an historian and as a citizen and as a human being. Eugen Weber, another important academic, not to be confused with Max Weber, but Eugen Weber writes a couple of important descriptions of Bloch as well. Bloch, like many of his generation, had a strong sense of personal honor, a factor that runs the risk of being lost from sight in a time like ours, which does not always recognize this form of self-respect. I highlight this passage for you because it raises questions very similar to the questions that we discussed when we talked about Socrates and why he defended himself in the way that he did, what his kind of inner thinking was as he prepared his defense and confronted his accusers. A second quote from Weber, "We are also talking about a strong patriotism nursed in a family of French Alsatian Jews who had left Alsace when the Germans occupied it, and for whom the national and the Republican commitment were one and the same thing." This is an important quotation, and possibly we'll get a chance to discuss it. I hope that we'll come back to these quotes. And then the final quote, "And we are talking about a man who, under a calm, restrained exterior, nursed strong feelings about right and wrong, along with the will to be true to himself. And what I invite you to do is to kind of read these short descriptions and try to piece together for yourselves, what does this say about the character of the man? That it's about honesty, honor, an identity which brings together French, Alsatian, Jewish, professor, resident and citizen and patriot of France. Kind of figuring that out, I think, is a really important and interesting part of the work we're doing in this course. Let's talk a little bit about Marc Bloch's theory of history, which is the subject of the next 2 weeks. But Marc Bloch was important, really just crucially important in the history of the development of the discipline of European history. He was French, but he did not devote all of his attention, his historical research and investigation to French history. He and Lucien Febvre, who was quoted a few minutes ago, created what is now referred to as the Annales school of history, which asks some very different kinds of questions for historians. They paid much more attention, and really I want to emphasize this point. Traditional history had a tendency to look at the history of dynasties, the history of kings and presidents and generals and Napoleon and the important turning points of history, kind of big history, big men doing big and important things. That was kind of a traditional way of writing history. The Annales school kind of introduced what we now refer to as material history or social history. It paid attention to the material circumstances of life and work, including things like geography. Where do people do their farming? Climate. How does climate affect culture? How does it affect how people live? And likewise, technology. And Marc Bloch wrote some just marvelous essays on the impact of new technologies, new in the 12th century, I might add, new technologies which transformed agriculture. The heavy plow is the one that I'm thinking of. But they were also interested in what they called mentalities, the mental frameworks in which people live their lives, the ideologies, the religious ideas, the religious worldviews, the myths. The Annales school was very interested in trying to reconstruct these mental frameworks and to kind of document that there was no single French identity or European identity or global identity. Instead, different regions, different peoples, different cultures had developed very different sets of ideas and self-conceptions and identities which affected the ways that they interacted with each other, the ways they behaved, and part of the historian's task is to try to figure that out. The Annales school was also very interested in comparative history. And so if they were interested in agriculture and the way that peasants and peasant farmers cultivated their fields and how they used child labor, how they used the children of their family to cultivate, they might also be interested in a comparison between French family farming in the, let's say, 15th century and Chinese family farming in, let's say, the 12th century. So comparative study of somewhat similar circumstances in very different national and cultural environments became an important part of the Annales school. And it is very striking that the Annales school was very interested in other parts of the world, not just Europe, not just France, not just Great Britain, but we're interested in the Americas, in Asia, and in Africa. And this is important because history as a discipline tended to be Eurocentric and tended often to have very kind of limiting and frankly kind of stupid ideas about circumstances in other countries. And the Annales school asked for serious, careful, rigorous investigation of social and economic and political circumstances in other countries. Why is it called Annales school, by the way? That's the name of a journal created by Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre in the 10s or 20s. So for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be taking on the topic of historiography and evidence in constructing an historical interpretation. And the big question is, how can human beings understand the past? How can we arrive at historical knowledge? What do we really know about the past? And what kinds of evidence are available for discovering the past? One thing which was really interesting about the discipline of history in the early part of the 20th century is that 19th century historians had made amazing progress on finding new ways of investigating, for example, the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic, investigating ancient history. They found that written texts gave only a partial picture of what life was like, what the circumstances were in ancient Rome. And so historians discovered new sources of evidence which might be used, including monuments, including inscriptions, including archaeological discoveries, and including, by the way, the ordinary writings of ordinary people, which from a different point of view is just irrelevant. Why would you care what a bricklayer thinks about the Roman Forum? Well, from a different point of view, it would be tremendously interesting to have the personal journal of a man who in whatever I'm not quite sure when the Forum was built, but in those years, if there were a laborer who also kept a journal, this would be really hugely interesting for historians today. And then finally, there is the question, the historiographic question, what kinds of choices is the historian forced to make? If you had the naive thought that history is just tell the story as it happened, tell the whole story as it happened based on the best possible evidence, well, you can just think about that for a few minutes and you can realize that's not possible. You can't tell the whole story. Instead, you have to decide what themes, what orientation will you take to the topic which you are investigating. And so there are really important choices that the historian has to make. Marc Bloch talks about some of those choices, and they are consequential. So the person who studies the Roman Empire from the point of view of political succession, that person will tell a very different story about ancient Rome than will the person who is primarily interested in the role of slavery in ancient Rome. So different choices lead to different histories. And it's very significant that in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, historians are way more interested today, and for the past 50 years, in topics in women's history, the history of slavery in the United States. We're interested, in other words, in histories of peoples and human beings whose lives have not often been the focus of historical research. There are a couple other points I wanted to make. One is Bloch's conception of the historian offered by Eugen Weber also. Quoting Weber, like our colleagues from the Palais de Justice, Bloch said, we collect testimony which we use to try to reconstruct reality. This model of a magistrate, embodying an investigator's probity, ingenuity, and a quest for a manifold, multifaceted truth, approximate, uncertain, but which one must encompass as best one can, this high sense of imaginative professionalism keeps coming up in Bloch's work. It's a very interesting passage because of what it says about the relationship between imagination and evidence, and I hope we'll be able to come back to this topic. This is the last slide, some parallels with Socrates. I think there are some parallels. One is that Bloch was very willing to challenge and criticize the academic and political establishment in which he lived. And there are a couple of interesting passages that illustrate this. Along with this, and equally irritating, no doubt, went Marc Bloch's unrelenting criticism of the educational system. Bloch's first attacks on the history curriculum go back to 1921. And I think a week or so ago, I drew your attention to a passage in which Bloch talks about how he would reform the educational system. And the second quote is, the existing system was hung up on exams and routine, stereotyped, unimaginative, and constraining. It discouraged initiative and stifled originality. It forced candidates to cram and professors to prepare ever-changing courses on sterile, isolated subjects, with the result that they could do no research. And this is coming from the Weber essay that you read. This is interesting, that Marc Bloch was willing to challenge the establishment, and he had some dramatically different ideas about youth, about how to educate the youth. That was what led to the death sentence against Socrates. It's not what led to Marc Bloch's death, but it was an important part of his advocacy, that France and the French universities and French high schools, collège, needed really to fundamentally change the way that they offered education to young people. So I hope you will agree with me that there's an awful lot to be learned from studying the life and career and thought of Marc Bloch, and I'm excited to be beginning a couple of weeks of discussion of his work. Thank you.